Hey there, everyone. Our next little tutorial here will just be about working with game objects and some of the tips and tricks that we use to navigate in Unity and kind of make our lives a little bit easier. I'm sure you're familiar with some of this stuff, but it's always good to go over. So you guys are going to be dealing mainly with simple Unity game objects for the game theory class, and they're all available here under 3D objects, so you can make something like a cube. Uh, Now you can move around your cube with the little arrows. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this kind of stuff, right? Uh, you're going to be doing a lot of work with just basic geometry, especially as game designers. We use cubes and things like that just to make simple levels, just so you can start running around and seeing what your level's like. So we use a lot of these really basic cubes on the go, and then just kind of to create little blockouts of levels and white boxes. Um, so in order to be a faster and kind of more organized game designer, you're going to have to kind of get used to navigating Unity and using these objects really quickly and accurately to kind of get what you want. So, you know how you can move with these arrows and move things around. You most likely also know that up here on the top left, you can switch to rotation and scale, which is great having these buttons. But one of the things I always recommend to students to try and kind of get used to and start using as early as they can is hot swaps between all of these tools, because you're going to be moving, scaling, rotating a lot, and taking your mouse from the screen all the way up here and then back down. Although it sounds simple, if you have to do it, a thousand times a day or a couple thousand times a day, that could be a lot of time spent just picking buttons. So in Unity, we use QWERT on the keyboard. So Q will give you just the pan tool. So if you just want to select your viewport, not actually move around your object. W will switch to the move tool. E will switch to the rotation tool, and R will switch to the scale tool, and T will switch to this 2D scale tool. So we'll talk about those in a little bit. And so really get used to using all those, right? Nice and fast. You never have to move your mouse away from your cube and all that. So really get used to just keeping your fingers over QWER and even T sometimes, and that'll make you a much better and quicker designer and just artist in general. So that's number one. So learn to move and quickly switch between all those. Number two is you're going to be duplicating a lot of objects. You're going to have to create a lot of objects. And I also recommend you learn the shortcut for that, which is Control D. That will just duplicate a cube for you. So if you look in the hierarchy, now we have a cube 1, and then you can move that out of the way. So, learn how to do that really quick, and you can start blocking out levels. You can also do that with multiple objects. So if you hold Control, you'll be able to multiple select objects, and then you can duplicate them all together and get them where you want. So with moving objects, one of the kind of things people always ask about is how do you align objects like really, precisely to each other, um, just so you could work really fast. Well, there's two ways to do that. Number one is Unity has a snaps feature. So if you hold Shift while moving, or sorry, Shift and Control while moving, you'll see that my object kind of snaps between positions. It's not as smooth as it is before. That's using Unity's snap tools, which are up here under Edit. Snap settings. This will snap my movement to one unit at a time. This will also snap my scale and my rotation. So rotation is quite nice. So if I'm going to go and rotate this object, it could be kind of hard to get an exact rotation that I want. I could type it in, but if I hold Control, oops, if I hold Control, you'll see it'll snap every 15 degrees, and it'll be nice, clean, even numbers. Scales the same way, and then movements like that too. So if my object, let's see, let me just zero this guy out here and duplicate him. And so you'll notice that because my cube is a scale of 1 unit each, and the movement is done to 1 unit each, when I hold Control and move my object here, he's going to snap directly 1 unit across, and they'll be perfectly aligned. Now, this is really good when you have objects that are exact scales, right, of 1 or 2, nice even numbers where you can snap them. And it's also great when you're moving objects from a location that it snaps nicely to, because if I move my object a little and then I hold control, well, it's going to still snap it by 1 unit, not very helpful. So what we do in that case is Unity has a nice little feature where you can snap objects based on their vertices. And what you do for that is you hold the V button on your keyboard, and what happens is when you hover over the cube, you'll see it'll start snapping to the different vertices on my cube, all the different corners. Well, while I'm holding V, I can click over here, and generally as long as this thing's on screen, I can click and hold, and I can snap it to any other vertice in the scene. So I can snap it to this cube here. So if I had a really, strange shape, right, trying to align this manually would be a bit of a pain in the butt. So what I could do is just hold V and snap. Duplicate, oops, duplicate, scale around and snap. Right, so nice easy way of making floors and walls and things like that, and snapping them really quickly without having to worry too much about placement, and that way you get nice clean lines and everything's flat. Really nice for level design. You can get some really nice quick levels going without having to stress too much. So that's that's kind of the movement stuff. I also want to talk about scale a little bit. You're going to be scaling around your objects quite a lot. Scaling things for white boxes and temporary things is perfectly fine. When you're working with actual art assets, we keep scaling to a minimum just because the textures start looking bad. But as a designer, you can scale away. Now, the problem with using Unity cubes is you'll notice that all the pivot points of our objects here are right in the center. So if I wanted to make a floor that was a little small, let's say like this, then I'd have to bring it back up. I got to use V to snap it on there. Can be kind of a pain in the butt. And the other thing that you may run into is, let's say you have a floor section here and a floor section here, and you want to make an object that fits in between here, but you don't want to adjust either of those objects. That's kind of a pain, and especially because the pivot's in the center, so then you're going to scale a little, move it, scale it, really giant pain in the butt. So what you can do is you can hit V, snap it to one of the sides, and we can hit the T button. And the T button is actually primarily used for the 2D side of Unity to scale and move around sprites, but it works quite well on 3D objects. So what you can do now with this, you see there's like a little bracket around our object, and when we hover over one of the edges, we get a little double-sided arrow. We can click and drag that and position it where we want. So quite nice on that end. You can scale around without having to worry about where your pivot is. Even if you had, let's say you wanted to do this guy and you had him down here, right? We can, I guess you can't really scale upwards as well. So from the top view, you're only going to be able to scale on a two-dimensional thing, because remember the scale tool is meant for 2D objects. But if you notice, if I swap my camera down low enough, that object switches from the side of the cube to the top of the cube. So if I position myself correctly, I can then scale upwards. So it's kind of a weird tool, and again, I don't know if it was really intended to be used on 3D objects as much as I think people use it now, but it's quite handy to adjust your objects and kind of get around that kind of stuff. So that's pretty much it for just managing simple objects, moving, scaling, rotating. Get really good at doing that stuff. A lot of the assignments in the game theory class are based around just using primitives to create scenes. So hopefully you guys will get a chance to use a lot of these techniques and things like that to get a little bit better. So practice doing this stuff, and it'll make you a much faster artist and designer. And especially when you're just blocking things out, you don't want to spend forever just selecting buttons and doing that kind of silly stuff. So, all right, that is that for that. Thanks.